Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to OpenView's webinar series. My name is Casey Renner, and I'm the Executive Network Director here at OpenView. For those of you who may be less familiar with us, OpenView is a venture capital firm based in Boston that focuses on expansion stage software companies and helping them acquire, retain, and grow the right customers and talent. And certainly encourage you to check out openviewpartners.com for more info. Today's webinar is on a topic that we found keeps software execs up at night, and that's pricing. Our hope for you after this webinar today is that you'll take away some strategies for go-to-market success and a few more hours of sleep. Leading the discussion today will be Kyle Poyar, our Director of Market Strategy here at OpenView. Kyle will also be walking us through findings of his pricing survey that he had done. Joining him will be Monica Sahav, VP of Marketing at Zora, and Guy Turner, who is the Managing Director at Hyde Park Ventures. A few housekeeping items before we kick it off. There will be time for Q&A at the end, but as questions come up through the conversation, please use the chat feature on the lower left-hand side of your screen, and we'll certainly try to get to as many as possible. And I will also be sending out the deck and recording after the webinar, so please keep an eye out for that. And all that being said, Kyle, I will turn it over to you to get started.
Great. Thanks, Casey. We wanted to get started by sharing the results of a survey that OpenView just conducted. We surveyed 1,000 plus SaaS companies about how they approach pricing. As Casey mentioned, one of the things we learned is it keeps a lot of people up at night. They're struggling with it. So we wanted to play back some of the things that we found and what companies are doing sort of in general and how stage influences the types of pricing decisions or how companies are making pricing decisions. And then we'll get into the Q&A with Monica and Guy. So as a quick note, the survey was actually interactive, so we were able to get so many people to take it because as you answered questions, we calculated a score about how the company that was taking the survey compared to all of the other companies and to best practices, how they really should be thinking about pricing. So at the end of the survey, they got a score that told them essentially how well they're doing and what they could be doing as next steps to get even better. One of the things that we knew pricing was a challenge for a lot of companies, but we realized how much of a challenge it was. Only 5% of companies scored above an 80 out of 100, which is that's a B where I come from. So only 5% scored a B or above. 95% scored below that, and our average score was about a 60. So definitely a lot of room for improvement, and it happens across stages. So pricing, it's a big blind spot, and what we're finding specifically is that companies are waiting until the last minute on pricing. So they really need to be thinking about pricing earlier on, especially as they're launching new products. They treat pricing as a one-off decision. So instead of building capabilities and a repeatability around thinking about pricing becomes something that, it's like we need to decide this just once, so let's get everyone in a room, make this decision, and then move on. But they don't realize pricing is something that needs to be revisited regularly as the product improves. Your company targets different segments in the market, acquisitions happen, and there's a number of different times when pricing might need to change. And then last is that companies aren't using enough data to make pricing decisions. Data has become a huge part of every other decision in a company's making, right? So where do you invest your marketing dollars? What target companies to have the BDR team focus on in terms of outbound calling, and tons of other decisions that a company makes. But pricing, which has a huge impact on the revenue of a business, is not something where companies are bringing a whole lot of data to bear. So I'll walk through these findings in more detail. First off, we're seeing that companies are waiting until the last minute on pricing. And in terms of how companies should be thinking about this, in my opinion, is that when you're building a product, you're going to be putting in a ton of engineering resources, product resources. There's a lot of time and effort that will go into it. And so don't you want to go into that huge effort knowing that you're building something that's solving a real need in the market that customers, potential customers will actually pay for, and that's going to be differentiated from what's already out there. So we found, a number of different third-party sources cite a statistic that 72% of new products fail. And a lot of why they fail is that the right product isn't built for the right market at the right time or with the right features. And then it's also not priced correctly. So if you bring pricing a lot earlier into the conversation, you're going to have a much better chance of success at really getting that product launch right and utilizing those product resources in a way that's going to be most effective. We're finding only 14% of SaaS companies have adopted this model, and too many think about pricing either right before the launch or as the product's getting ready for launch. And another thing where this comes into play is that when it comes to pricing, you're also thinking about what packages or different tiers or additions that you have, and what features should go into each of those. And that has a huge influence on how the product is built, how the provisioning works. And so if you're not thinking about pricing early on, then it limits a lot of the options that the team has with pricing without a whole lot of rework on the product side. So I would first takeaway is that make sure pricing is thought about earlier in the product process. Second is that I mentioned that people are using more and more data to make decisions, except for in pricing. What I also see is as companies are growing, they bring on functional experts or functional leaders to take on different roles where it's really helpful to have someone that's been there, done that, and that can be held accountable if specific metrics of the company aren't moving in the right direction. So this is what HubSpot's org chart looked like when they were at 100 employees. You see, finance team, marketing team, sales team, services, IT and ops, engineering, product, and then specifically they have one or more recruiters that can take on talent acquisition. Within marketing, they probably have someone that does digital marketing, demand gen, events, content marketing. So people start to really specialize within different fields. And within sales, there's probably not just all salespeople are created equal. There's different there's people that do outbound sales versus inbound. There's maybe teams that focus on smaller business, medium businesses, larger businesses. But what we don't see is, there's no specialization in pricing and no one that really necessarily knows how to do pricing in the organization. So pricing, it's one of the 4 Ps. So naturally you would kind of expect it falls under marketing. But a lot of times marketing doesn't have pricing-specific expertise. And then the product team, finance team, sales team, executive team all have a lot of input, ideas, thoughts. They all want to have a seat at the table. And so pricing becomes this, one-off decision that's made on an ad hoc basis with a bunch of people around a table. But there's no single individual or team that's working on getting the data and making informed decisions and monitoring those decisions to adjust and get things back on track if the wrong decision has been made. So to give a little bit more data behind this statement, as part of our survey, we asked companies, how many people or who's working on pricing in your company? Do you have anyone at all? Is it a part of someone's responsibilities? Or do you actually have an individual pricing manager or a team that works on packaging and pricing? What we found is at the expansion stage, 55% of companies said nobody is working on pricing, even as a piece of their responsibilities. And when they do have someone working on pricing, it's a small part of their job description, right? So it's maybe part of a product marketer's job description. The VP of product maybe has that as part of their job, along with a lot of other things as well. And at growth stage companies, they're a little bit better, but not a whole lot better. You can still see there's a lot of companies where pricing is, no one owns pricing and no one is working on pricing, even though I think it's a strategically important decision. And so if you have a business where you have a lot of different functional experts, the business is growing, but you don't have someone working on something, that tends to signal that the company doesn't really care about that topic. But the reverse is actually true with pricing, and I'll show that on the next slide. Pricing tends to actually fall to the CEO because no one is working on it functionally. The CEO takes it on, and it's one of the responsibilities that that goes with the millions of other things that they're working on. And so there was a quick question around the definitions of the stages here. The expansion stage is companies with 1 to 20 million in annual recurring revenue, and the growth stage was defined as above 20 million in annual recurring revenue. So as I mentioned, you might think with not using data on pricing, with not having anyone, that has it as part of their job description, that the company doesn't care about it. But in reality, 68% said the CEO ultimately owns pricing. And so if it's a decision that the CEO is making and that's strategically important, shouldn't you be building a process, tools, and collecting the right data to really make an informed decision here? The other thing to highlight here is that when the CEO isn't, ultimately responsible for pricing, I get asked a lot, where should pricing fit in the organization? And you could see that there's a mix, right? So there's 12% said sales, 12% said product or product marketing, only 3% said marketing here. I've tended to find that it can go into, it can really fall into each of the different functions depending on the company. It fits, in my opinion, best in product or marketing, but it depends on the kind of audience that you're selling to, the skill sets of the team, and I think we'll have a great discussion between Monica and Guy further to talk about where pricing should sit. Monica, as head of marketing, probably has a specific opinion on that, and can probably talk about her experience. The last slide that I wanted to share was around the data that companies are using. So we asked companies how much customer development goes into their pricing. They're actually talking to customers to get feedback around how much value their product is delivering and what's the willingness to pay. So in an ideal world with extensive pricing research, you maybe have pricing-specific questions like a Van Westendorp method or a conjoint, but then even just cursory market research, you're understanding the general perception of value versus price and where your customers are kind of at a high level in terms of their thoughts about pricing. And then what we're finding is that 45% of companies aren't doing even this cursory research, and that they're doing no customer development or voice of customer work when it comes to pricing. And this was pretty consistent across the stage of the company. So even larger companies weren't doing a whole lot of customer development. Separately, we asked a question about how much piloting or testing, especially scientific testing, A/B testing, that goes into pricing to see the before and after and the impacts of pricing changes. And the numbers look very similar to this, with about 50% doing no piloting or testing, and the remainder typically doing some pretty basic testing, and only a handful being really best in class when it comes to this. So in terms of how to get better and overcome some of these common challenges that we see, we have a guide that we've released that's called the Ultimate SaaS Pricing Guide for Seed Stage Companies. And you can download that at this link, and then we're going to talk through with our group discussion, thoughts from Monica and Guy about how companies can get better. So Monica and Guy, what would be great actually to start off is if you could, introduce yourselves a little further, so the audience has context about, who you are and what you're working on. So maybe start with Monica.
Yep, definitely. Thanks, Kyle. And so really excited to be on this webinar today. And a quick note about myself. So I've been in the software/SaaS industry for the last 20 years or so, and the last 8 of which were spent at Zuora. I'm currently heading up marketing, and I own which also includes product marketing as a function. And so as we get into further discussions about who should own pricing, I can definitely share some stories on that. In terms of what we do here at Zuora, so Zuora is a company that helps businesses of any industry take products to market in a subscription business model fashion. So the subscription business model is basically any kind of business model where you want to establish a recurring relationship with your customer, and billing tends to be either a recurring billing, flat recurring fee, or a variable fee that you charge on any kind of frequency. So that's what we do in a nutshell here at Zuora.
Great. Guy, do you want to go next?
Yeah, you bet. Thanks, Kyle. Thanks, Monica. It's awesome to be here. I'm Guy Turner, a partner at Hyde Park Venture Partners. We focus on the Midwest, early stage investing in the Midwest. We typically write checks of $100,000 to $2 million in rounds of 1 to 7, where companies are anywhere from their earliest point of proof of concept up to $3 million in revenue. About 60% of what we do is B2B software, and of course that aligns very nicely with OpenView. We also do marketplaces and other types of consumer models as well. And just really happy to be here and talk about this important issue. It's really, pricing is really where the rubber meets the road on monetization, so critical topic.
Great. And I wanted to start off with, there's a question from one of the audience members that I think is a great fundamental question with pricing, and this is from Calvin. And he asked about, there is a balance between growth and profitability as it relates to setting pricing, and raising prices or going at a very premium pricing strategy might mean slowing down acquisition and user growth, but becoming much more profitable as a company, and vice versa. And curious to get both of your takes, Monica and Guy, about how you strike the right balancing act between growth and profitability as it relates to setting prices, and how you've approached that. Maybe we start with Guy.
Sure. So I think there's a dimension to think really strongly about in that trade-off, and that is how much virality is there in your product. And if there's a lot of virality naturally in the usage of the product, obviously Slack is a great example, or Dropbox is a great example, versus government risk and compliance enterprise sale, for which there probably isn't much virality or network effects. So if you look at that axis, then you say, well, if I start increasing price, I create friction to virality and maybe to network effects. And so there's a pretty significant trade-off of doing that early in a startup's life if you have a viral product. If you don't have a viral product, then I think increasing your price and really understanding what your pricing power is early on has a lot of value. So I think the trade-off falls on that axis. If you have a viral product, then I would be careful about raising price early on, because you may kill that viral loop, and that's going to really kill your growth. But if you have really an enterprise product without a lot of virality and a lot of network effects, then often proving that value is really critical to achieving milestones that are fundable.
I think that's a great point. Monica, anything you wanted to add from your perspective?
No, I would agree with those, and I think that there's definitely an exercise of defining the right pricing profiles that companies should go through at different stages. And so depending on what product you're taking to market, which, Guy's examples were great. Let's say you have something that can be viral, and then you've also got, or you're a company that's going to market with a complex B2B enterprise product. Even within those within those segments, defining pricing profiles early is an important consideration, because if you think about even B2B enterprise sales, depending on what growth stage you're in your own company, if you're just in the early stages, you're trying to prove the product and you're trying to prove that there's a market, understanding the common needs that you want to address in the immediate term, and determining what other market forces are going to be in play as you try and capture your first 100, 150 customers, or your first 50 customers. That's going to really determine your starting price, and then how much pressure do you perceive that starting price will get based on, number one, the value that you're going to provide, but also other vendors in the market that could be adjacent or competitive to your solution.
Yeah, those are great points, and I think one thing I would add that I think is very related is that, and something that Brent from PicMonkey actually was mentioning at an event that I went to last week, there's an element to what's your go-to-market model. So if you're selling mostly through self-service, you are typically targeting contract values in the maybe hundreds of dollars per year, versus it takes about a $10,000 or above price point to sustain a really good outbound sales model. And then anywhere in between can be sort of no man's land, not providing enough revenue to offset the customer acquisition cost of having a fully built out outbound sales model and all of the paid marketing that would go into acquiring customers. But then so you can get stuck essentially with your pricing, and so you also want to take into account what's the pricing that's going to be necessary to sustain the way that you want to bring your product to market in an efficient way. Because if your pricing is so low that you can't put any marketing or sales dollars behind it, then you're not going to really be able to sustainably grow the business. So the next thing that I wanted to talk more about is startup CEOs have so many items on their plate, right? And we saw that 68% of them are ultimately making pricing decisions. Why should pricing, in your opinion, be something that the CEO should be thinking about? Why are CEOs thinking about it? Maybe we'll start with Monica this time.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we should be thinking about it early, obviously, because the pricing aspect of any startup product or any product that a startup is trying to take to market is ultimately what will also validate the value of that product and how the market will perceive the value of the product. So, getting started early in thinking through the pricing models and also the packaging models helps validate whether there is a market, but also how that market's going to perceive the value of all of the efforts that the CEO is going to be putting in to building up that company and building up the product.
Yeah, I very much agree with Monica. And the other thing is, and Kyle, I think you alluded to this in the presentation, but you want to leave yourself optionality. And if you choose a pricing mechanism early on that doesn't leave you optionality on how you might change your pricing later or change your product later, that can be a problem. So explicitly, if you basically offer a product where every update is promised to be free and that's part of your pricing promise, then you've trapped yourself for the future. Or if you've launched a product that is all you can eat from a user perspective, then it's going to be really hard later on to go back to your customers and say, hey, remember when I sold you that product and I said you could have as many users as you want? Well, that has to change. And those are hard conversations to have, so you have to anticipate the future a little bit. I think the other thing to think about on pricing is that it truly is so critical. I mean, it's one of the key things about your product. And if you aren't super ahead of it from the point where you're really thinking about the product, you may miss some big opportunities. And so what I mean from that is one of the things we haven't talked much about and didn't show up in the slides is whether how much time you spend looking at your competition and how they're pricing. So obviously that's important. Market derives price. People don't clear a market by just making up a price. And that can actually be a really fascinating place to look for differentiation. And pricing as differentiation is actually a really common thing you see in startups. In fact, in real estate technology right now, there's a lot of startups that are offering rental management services, online rental management services, online brokerages at a fixed price and a relatively low fixed price because technology so reduces the cost versus offline brokers. And that is fundamentally their differentiation. And had they not thought about that at the beginning, there would be no product. I mean, in a sense, the pricing is a huge part of their product and a huge part of how they position the product.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely. And we talked a lot about the negative, how companies shouldn't be doing things. But I'd love to hear both of your perspectives on what does a best practice look like? How should startups be thinking about and approaching pricing? Walk us through what best in class looks like. We'll be starting with Monica again.
Yeah, so I think that, obviously every company sort of tailors their approach depending on what markets they're serving, but there are a couple of things that come to mind that in my mind are very crucial. The first thing is that as companies are designing their pricing, they've got to think through two paths of growing revenue long term through the products that they're going to bring to market. And one path is what I call capability-driven growth levers that you can attach different pricing to. And the other is what I call consumption-driven pricing levers. So a capability-driven growth lever is, to use an example, let's say that you've got a company that is going to be selling, help desk software. A capability-driven growth lever might be, let's say you've got a flavor of your product that provides help desk software for companies that are going to be, doing business in one language, let's say it's English. Over time, what you might do as your product roadmap grows and as you start delivering more capabilities, the ability to support self-service in multiple languages, that's what I would call a capability-driven growth lever. So then you can sort of have a multi-year product strategy and pricing strategy that you start thinking of early, and you say, okay, over time we're going to add these additional things, and as we add, for example, capabilities like providing support in multiple languages, that becomes a capability-driven lever that we assume people would pay a premium for. And then a consumption-driven lever is, let's say that we are going to, price this on a per user basis. As more and more users use more of the same, we're going to charge more per user. So giving yourself the room to have capability-driven as well as consumption-driven growth levers, number one, especially for SaaS companies, gives you a way to help monetize a lot of your future innovation that will be coming down the pipe. It gives you that flexibility versus tying everything to, let's say, just consumption. And then the second thing is, you definitely want to define your pricing profiles early. So in marketing, we talk a lot about buying profiles, but pricing profiles are basically looking at your market and figuring out what are the clusters of common needs in the market that you're going to address. And so what ends up happening is as you find major clusters within your market, those end up mapping to baseline packages, and then edge needs end up mapping to things that you can charge a premium for, or things that companies will be willing to go out of their way to pay more for, and then adoption signals, which is as people start to use more and more of your product, what are the signals of adoption that you want to pick up on and potentially monetize those if it makes sense as well. So thinking through a long-term strategy for your product roadmap and then also mapping that to a long-term pricing strategy is really key.
Kyle, I might just add one thing to Monica's great points, which is that the other dimension to think about is segmentation of customer size and complexity of the customer. And so some of that comes out in feature capability, that feature capability lever. But the other is what ecosystem is that customer playing in. So let me give you an example. If you sell a B2B software that is selling in both to small, medium-sized business, but also enterprise, and let's just say it's a marketing solution, well, then there's two key integrations you're going to want to consider. You're going to want to consider MailChimp, obviously, and you're probably going to want to consider ExactTarget, Salesforce. But what's cool about those two integrations is they're very, very different types of customers that use those two software platforms. It is a price discrimination tool. So you can actually charge a lot more for the ExactTarget integration because the customers that use ExactTarget tend to be larger and more valuable customers, and the smaller guys who use MailChimp are smaller. So I always think about on the certainly on the feature point of how different segments use the product, you can price discriminate based on that, but also you can price discriminate based on the types of integrations that different size customers want to have.
Definitely a great point. And I think following up there was a question from a couple people that are listening in that have asked about just how to approach packaging in general. So, what to put in a bundle versus, or a certain package versus to include in another package, or, whether to offer a full bundle or sell more individual services a la carte, and just how to think about those challenges and best ways to approach it. So maybe we start with Guy on that question.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think this also ties to the transparency of pricing, whether you put your pricing on the website or not. I think it's all about transparency and not being nickeled and dimed. I think there's an increasing interest among software buyers for transparency. And I do actually believe that that's not just about what information is public, but it's also what do I really get with this product? Is there lots of a la carte stuff and it's kind of confusing, and then I may buy the product and 5 months later realize I need to pay more for this, that, and the other. So I'm generally a believer in sort of the more bundled approach where you have tiers, sort of the classic price tiering that you'd see on a self-service website. But I do think that changes a lot when you get into true pure enterprise. In enterprise, every customer wants something a little bit different, and you have to make sure that you get paid for it. And the obvious one is customized services, whether that be integrations, whether that be implementation services, and you just have to charge for them. And those big customers are used to paying them, and that's all part of the specification and statement of work development. But in medium-sized and small business software, I think having bundled tiers is really the way to go. And I think that's probably where we've seen the biggest success in a lot of the big SaaS companies that stood out.
Great. And Monica, your thoughts?
Yeah, so I'm going to go back to that pricing or the packaging framework that I was talking about earlier, where if we take Guy's example of you've got a company that potentially might be serving both the mid-market and the large enterprises with a B2B the way that I would recommend going about it is your SMB market may have a set of what I call common needs, and those should end up being in sort of a baseline package for the SMB market. And then there's going to be certain capabilities that you could go either way, what I'll call edge needs for the SMB market that are common with what the enterprise market might need. And so those you should price as a premium add-on to the SMB package, but price it in a way that the baseline package for SMB plus the add-on should provide a tipping point for somebody to go to the enterprise package. So this whole notion of designing tipping points in your packaging is a very interesting one, and I've had lots of conversations with companies around that. And then your enterprise package, obviously, in this example that I'm talking about, it may have what you might be offering to the SMB customers, but additional things that are very specific to the enterprise market. As Guy had mentioned, specific integrations that are very, very useful for the enterprise customers. And then the conversation there that you have to have is, for the things that are specific to that particular market, should they be included in the package, or should they always be offered as an add-on, an optional add-on? And in those cases, again, depending on what your core base needs are for your enterprise market, those things, where it would, you feel like 80% of the market is going to need this, that should go in your base package. And then whether you charge an add-on, a premium fee for additional capabilities is driven by what is the upsell path that you want to have. There's arguments to be made, both ways. Do you want customers to always pay for every additional feature, or do you package it in logical ways where it doesn't feel like you're nickeling and diming them? That packaging design becomes really important, but it always comes down to, for every pricing profile, which typically maps to your market segments, what are their common needs, their edge needs, and their adoption signals. And that can really give you a lot of insight into what are your different baseline packages, what are add-ons, and then how do you tip people from one to another at different points.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to Guy's point as well about if you see that certain integrations like ExactTarget are going to be needed by the larger enterprise customers, but then a MailChimp would be needed by an SMB, that can go into what integrations you put in each package. So it's not like integrations are only for enterprise. It's certain integrations could be included for everyone, and then certain ones could be that fence for the higher tier packages. But there's been another question, I think, related to this that I get asked a lot of it. Just how do you go about testing, and whether it's testing through true A/B testing or testing through market research, different pricing models or different package tiers? What's the best approach for testing that to really make sure you've gotten it right? Maybe we start with Monica here.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a huge believer in the best form of testing, especially if you're a B2B company, is go talk to as many customers or prospective customers as you can. You'd be surprised at, and the type of testing, when we're speaking to customers about pricing certain aspects of our product, something that might be on the roadmap or something that we currently have that we feel that we want to change the pricing model or change the price point, having conversations with customers and even prospective customers and really being direct in the question about what would you be willing to pay for something like this. I'm a buyer of software as well. If a vendor comes to me and says, what would you be willing to pay? My usual response is, well, I'd love for it to be all included. But then the trick is, how do you actually, what's in your follow-up questions? And the follow-up questions are, what are other alternative solutions that you might use if we were not to include this in what you're already using? And what are some of the things that you would be able to do if we were to include this capability and price this at a certain point? So you start assessing the value, and you start to understand how a customer might value this, and you're able to kind of come up with a price point that they would be agreeable to. So talking to customers often and early, even as you're designing the product, is crucial. And then when it comes to actually testing it from a real world standpoint, I'm a big believer in what Guy said earlier, which is never lock yourself into a corner with pricing. Leave yourself optionality. So even when you decide to go with a certain pricing strategy for a product and you put it out there, you should always be ensuring that is the price that it should stay at, and looking at what are the pressures that price point might be facing from other vendors out there, as well as other pressures from a market standpoint or from a buyer standpoint.
Yeah, I don't think I have anything to add to that. It was great.
Great. So then another question that goes back to, Guy, something that you brought up, is the idea of transparency in pricing. So I know you mentioned being a big fan of transparency, putting your pricing out there. I know a lot of companies are really afraid of doing that, or there's a lot of valid concerns about it. What's your perspective on when publishing pricing online makes sense, when it doesn't make sense?
Yeah, so at the risk of kind of recapping what I said before, I think the concerns about putting pricing out there are, A, perhaps you reduce your optionality to change price if you screw it up, to Monica's point, and then B, your competition is going to find out what your prices are. So just to clear the air on the second one, assume your competition always knows what your price is, because they're talking to the same customers, they're pretending they are potential customers and calling you. So that should not be a concern. Your competition always knows what your prices are. So then back to the first one of limiting optionality, I think there is some concern there. But what's interesting is if you're talking about transparent pricing, which I think tends to be self-service and inside sales, so not enterprise. In the early days, you start with a customer base of maybe 100 customers, and if you're successful, then 5 years later, you're going to have 10,000 customers. If you underpriced or mispriced in the first 100, it doesn't matter. If you end up lowering your price, you go back to them and say, hey, guys, I've got a deal for you. I want to treat you fairly. By the way, that never happens. Usually the price is going the other way, and you grandfather them in. So I don't really see that much risk in public pricing for self-service, and in fact, it's necessary for self-service. You can't sell something to someone if they don't know what the price is. And then for inside sales, I think that's the same thing. And I'll give a couple reasons there, which is, number one, if you have public pricing for an inside sales sale, so again, whether it's inbound or outbound, but in the end, a human being calls you up and says, hey, I got your lead. I'd love to sell you my software. And if you're both starting from a public pricing of, hey, I know that as a customer, I know that this is generally X per user, and as a salesperson, you know that this is generally X per user, then as the customer, I don't feel like I'm going to be screwed by that salesperson. And in fact, if they can then go give me a little bit of a discount off the public price, I'm going to feel great about it, versus both of us starting without a common knowledge of where the center point is likely to be, and it creates a lot of friction in the sales process, which can be a problem. And we've seen that. I've seen that with inside sales models where there is no public pricing, and the pricing that is achieved by the sales team is all over the place, and that's not really a good experience for customers either. Now, on enterprise, it's very custom for lots of different reasons, and largely because the needs of every customer tends to be a little bit different. And in those cases, I think public pricing doesn't serve much good. But for self-service and inside sales, it's pretty critical.
Anything to add, Monica?
Yeah, no, I would agree with Guy that if you're selling your product via self-service, absolutely pricing should be transparent. And for companies that are putting pricing on their website, we have quite a few customers that are B2B, they sell B2B software and they're selling it via self-service for some of the lower ends of their market. The one thing that I would add there is if you're going to sell through self-service, you can put pricing out there. And if you are selling software, and enterprise software, and you're doing that sort of in the mid-market space, it is hugely valuable to provide a way for prospective customers to try your product out. So sometimes, depending on what kind of service you're bringing to market, if it's something that people can relate to in their day-to-day, so if it's a B2C kind of service, they can look at the pricing, they can kind of read about it on the website, they can try it out, and they get a good sense for it. But in the B2B space, especially companies that are selling more enterprise software, if you decide to put your pricing out there and put transparent pricing out there, then I highly recommend that do that only if you can provide a way for people to experience your product in a guided way, because then it helps them understand the value that your product is going to provide, and then they see the pricing and so they get it.
Got it. Then something that I saw Mike was asking about this in one of the questions. I had this on my list too. Was really around freemium strategies, and I think this relates a lot back to having a self-service option as well. So a number of companies are struggling with whether they should offer a freemium version of their product, especially when maybe it's a product where historically they've seen that a customer has to talk to someone, really demo it to see the full value, see all the use cases. And curious about, Monica and Guy, both of your takes around freemium and when it's right for a business versus could be a distraction. Sorry,
I guess I'll hop in. I'll hop in quickly. So I think the freemium, I think this in many ways ties back to my comment about virality. So if you have a highly viral product, and again, to hit on the big winners, Dropbox and Slack, freemium is perfect for those types of products because in the long run, once it kind of goes viral and becomes very, very sticky because people are using it all the time, then you have an enormous amount of leverage to charge them. And whether it's they upsell themselves into a higher level of usage, more seats, more storage, whatever it is, all the leverage that Monica talked about, or whether you just go to them and say, hey, guess what, guys, we're now charging money for this, you can probably get away with it. But for anything except, basically small business or consumer SaaS where there's a big viral loop, I'm pretty wary of freemium these days, and that's changed over time. So we're investors in an ag tech company called FarmLogs. It's a phenomenal company. They were early to the ag tech market with a set of customers, small, medium, and large farmers who were relatively new to buying software and were a little bit suspicious. And our view was, look, we've got to convince them that there's value before we ask them to pay. And we were able to do that phenomenally well. But this was like 5 years ago. And in the last 5 years, people have become both individuals and businesses have been much more accustomed to paying for software when it has value. And so nowadays, I think if someone were entering the ag tech market, I would discourage them from doing a freemium premium model. I think at the time it was a great land grab when customers weren't yet ready to spend, but now they are. And so I think that trend is very true in a lot of different industries now. And so with the exception of that viral loop, generally discourage freemium premium.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree with that. The big factor is virality, and maybe the only other point I might add is sometimes it may make sense depending on if you have an opportunity for sort of two-sided monetization. So LinkedIn is an example that comes to mind where we as LinkedIn users, it's free to join LinkedIn and use the majority of the B2C facing LinkedIn features, but then LinkedIn is monetizing the B2B side of it pretty heavily. So it's not necessarily a 100% freemium model, but that might be one consideration for companies that want one dimension of their user base it might be free for, but another dimension of their user base they are able to monetize in a good way. Then it may make sense, but otherwise I 100% agree. Like especially for B2B enterprise software, it's a difficult one to pull off.
Got it. And I want to go back to something that that I kind of talked about earlier that is fundamental to some of these pricing decisions. Is that who should be involved and who should be making the pricing decisions. If we'll start with Monica on this one, what's your perspective there?
Yeah. So I've been through multiple evolutions of this, even here at Zora. I think that there is an ideal state, but there's also the reality of just being at a startup and the phases that we go through. In the early stages of the company, pricing was very much driven by heavy involvement from our CEO and very much driven by sales leadership. And then we kind of did that for a couple of years, and then we got to a different stage of our company where pricing was driven very much by the finance organization. And that sort of worked for a little while, but didn't really work in the long term because then it was too disconnected from the product strategy, and we weren't making very good decisions on how to package things together in a way that made logical sense. And so now, the stage that we're at, pricing is co-ownership between the head of product marketing and the VP of finance. And so it's very much, the VP of finance who also owns a lot of our sales and finance operations. So it's very much a data-driven model that aligns to our overall business strategy and our business model. And then from a product marketing standpoint, we kind of bring to the table our expertise or our knowledge or our point of view from a marketing, sales, and long-term product strategy standpoint. So that it's a joint ownership, two people very much held responsible and accountable, but we constantly have to make sure that different stakeholders within the company are involved. And in my mind, joint ownership between those two functions does make sense, but you constantly have to make sure that you are bringing along the various stakeholders within different departments into your decisions. Otherwise, you will not be making the right decisions.
Yeah, I don't think I have much to add to that. It makes very much follows the evolution that we see for growing startup.
Great, and then we can take one more question. So I'm curious about, and this is partly related to pricing, but partly not, and it's something that a number of people ask about. You both have mentioned freemium works really well when there's a virality component to pricing, but that for a lot of software as a service businesses, it's really not needed or might be counterproductive. How should companies think about offsetting maybe some of the lost leads or lost volume from maybe getting rid of freemium and then moving towards a premium only, paid only way of pricing? Maybe Guy for that one.
Yeah, I think two answers to that. The first is pretty flippant, which is you don't really want customers who are never going to pay. And again, that's pretty flip. But the second answer is, there is a workaround. If the idea is you want to give people a relatively low friction way to try your product, there is the free trial. And that should not be confused with freemium premium. I don't think we've talked about it too much yet, but I think the free trial is a great way to do it for self-service and also for inside sales product. It gives people a really safe way to try the product out, and yet it gives you as the startup and the sales team a lever, a ticking time bomb to really perform and show them that the product is great and meet their expectations, and then kind of lay the law down and say, hey, okay, the trial's up, you're either in or you're out. So I'm definitely a believer in that, and I think that's a good happy median.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think that if a company is planning to make the switch, a lot of the product capabilities that may have been developed for the free end, the free end of the freemium model, like the ability to quickly, turn on the service and have people poke around and try it out. That is something, even though you move away from the freemium model, that's something that you should definitely keep in order to give enterprise customers a free trial, because if you can show that by giving your enterprise B2B buyers, by giving the ability for them to try out, even if it's a curated path for them to go try out your product, by giving them a curated path for trying out your product, you can shrink your sales cycle where before it would have taken 90 days for you to close a deal, and now with the free trial, using some of the capabilities of what used to be freemium, you're shrinking that sales cycle down to something much shorter. Then you're at the end of the day reducing your cost of sale even in the paid efforts that you're doing. So if a company is trying to move away from the freemium model, one way to do that in a cost-effective way is don't get rid of all those product capabilities that you built for the free users. Leverage that in a way, to Guy's point, to give your enterprise buyers a way to quickly try the product, or your paid folks a way to quickly try the product.
Great, and I'll transfer things over to Casey to go through housekeeping items, and maybe I'd see a lot of extra questions through the chat functionality, so we talk through a way to, if people have follow-up questions, how they can get in touch.
Yeah, thank you, Kyle and Guy and Monica. Really, really interesting to hear the conversation, and to all of you as well who joined us. Really appreciate you taking the time out. And as to reference what Kyle just said, I know that there were a lot of questions we didn't get a chance to get to. I have kept track of all of them, so we'll work with Kyle, Monica, and Guy to facilitate getting those answered for you. In addition, I will be sending out the recording, as I mentioned earlier. I will also include the 2 links that we had sent out, so you'll have those as well. And if there's any other questions you have, you all have my email. Please feel free to reach out with anything. And keep an eye on our upcoming events page for upcoming webinars, and we look forward to having you soon. Have a great day.